People are settled in. I guess I'll just introduce myself and then my co-panelists. I hope you guys are all excited to come here and learn today. Who am I? My name is Brother Ming. I make print and play games online for fun. I kind of got started with a Fire Emblem board game, and that's kind of why I'm cosplaying as a Fire Emblem character today. And then Nintendo DMCA'd it, so that was a badge of honor I wear with pride. But yeah, I am here to just give all these lovely professionals a way to communicate their thoughts and ideas. So, we are here today to talk about a very specific niche of diversity in gaming. But even though it's a specific niche, it's one that everybody kind of knows about, and that's kind of the familiarity and prevalence of Asian culture and themes in the analog gaming space. So kind of, from the very first issue of Dungeons & Dragons, Oriental Adventures, and to this year's release, Way of the Panda. We have a lot of problematic depictions of Asian culture in board gaming. And so we're here to kind of unpack that. Hopefully at the end of this, we'll shed some light on the topic with our panel of diverse professionals in the industry, unlike me, and kind of show the whys and hows of Asian themes are used in board games. We hope that you will take with you after this some action items and just inspiration if you are also thinking about making one, and how you can approach the topic, in a way that will make us happy, right? And make everybody happy, really, as the goal. So, to start with, let's introduce our panelists. So, from the left here, I leaned way too far. We have Victoria. She's a game designer and a producer at Wizards of the Coast. Victoria, would you like to say something about yourself?
No, I think you said everything.
Oh. 2 sentences, everybody. That is somebody's entire life. Okay, no. Okay, we'll move on. Next to her, we have Banana Chan. She's the owner of Game and a Curry and has very awesome friends who showed up.
Yeah! Friendship!
Now you must scream for all of us or we will be sad.
Pretend you're our friends and then... Just kidding. So, she's also the publisher behind the recently released Judge Dredd game, which there will be a launch party tonight. Banana?
Yes, if anyone's available between 5 and 8, we're having a release party down at Red Caps, or I should say up at Red Caps because it's one open. Yeah.
All right, and then moving over, we have Sharong, and if I say that wrong, say it again. He is an internationally published and exhibited designer, writer, and artist at night, but during the day, he is a diversity consultant. Take it away. You're supposed to lean in. All your friends who are here to support you. I will talk. Okay, so continuing on, we have next to him Cleo, the co-founder of Janitor Interactive and creator of Battle the Boy Bands. You want to talk a little about that?
Sorry, I was going to give you like an ASMR experience. I don't know what you mic to use. Does it? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, cool. Battle the Boy Band is a card game that's very K-pop inspired, and generally I've done several other K-pop inspired games.
Classic.
Oh, and Barb's company, Game and Curry, or Banana's company, Game and Curry, will be publishing it, and it will be released probably sometime in mid-2019.
So look out for that.
The indie game design world is very incestuous in that we work together a lot, especially if you're Asian.
And the last one on the far right, we have Mendez, the designer and cultural consultant for the currently on Kickstarter until 7 p.m., one stretch goal away from all the stretch goals unlocking, 1,000 Arrows, a game about Japanese warring states, a tabletop RPG. Yeah.
Hey, it was good. I'm Mendez. I write, develop, edit, and cultural consult on tabletop RPGs. You might know me from 7C 2nd edition, Scion 2nd edition, 4 pages of Monster Hearts 2, or several other things I wrote.
All right, so we're just going to dive right into kind of the meat of the topic, and that is kind of, I want to talk about the prevalence of Asian cultures in analog games, because I come from a video game background, video game character, and you know, growing up with video games, there is a distinct disparity for how many Asian themes I see in board games having gone into this space compared to what I grew up with video games. So that's kind of want to be the first topic. Why do you guys think there are such a disproportionate representation in analog games compared to traditional video games? Sharon?
So do people like the mic, or do they not like the mic? Great, no one's ever told me that before. So this is really interesting, right? Because so if you read Mary Flanagan's critical play, among other books of game history, I mean, you're probably familiar with the idea that people are like, oh, games are a new medium. No. People have been making games since they have been making culture, right? Which is throughout the existence of humanity, right? You can find Mancala games that are thousands and thousands of years old. So every culture makes games. But tabletop role-playing games, which influences a lot of the narrative-style board games, is a very American thing, right? Like it started with chainmail, which then became Dungeons and Dragons, and then out of that spawned this whole subgroup of indie games, and then LARP and all that kind of stuff, right? And unlike video games, which are an offshoot of information technology, which you need to exist in the modern world, you don't need tabletop games to mediate capitalism, right? And so I think that video games have spread through the spread of like computers and through that kind of technology, while tabletop games that are narrative-based are actually a rather Western thing, and I would actually say a very specifically American thing, and that's spreading across the world, and that spread is a lot slower. And so if that spread of tabletop games is slower, that means it has less of an opportunity to be influenced by other cultures. That's happening more slowly. And so I think the Western, specifically American viewpoint, it then becomes a dominant theme in that. And we know this about all kinds of media, right? American media is the most widespread and popular type of entertainment in the world. Like, everyone knows that, right? I mean, you can argue that, yes, Bollywood produces more movies than America does, than Hollywood, but more people know about American media than Indian media, for example. So I think that's the reason why this American viewpoint is so widespread.
Yeah, like you have in video games historically, like, the biggest one that all my friends in middle school here, we play Dynasty Warriors, right? Like you have like those things, right, that come out of Asia, but as board game has grew really from here, the West, that kind of originality hasn't come forth. So a lot of it is definitely what the West sees Asia as. So anyone else want to talk about this?
So when I studied media in college, one of the things that we learned about was there's this idea when you're a Westerner that when you're going to travel to other countries, I don't know if it sounds louder when you talk, but not when I talk.
You gotta get up real close.
That when you
Sharon's
travel,
special.
oh, is it working?
Yeah.
You just gotta get up real
Right
close to it.
here. Oh, okay. That when you travel to other countries, that you're going to experience that country in the past, like this idea of cultural commodification and consumption. And so I think part of why Asian themes and board games is so popular is because we really like this idea of traveling or experiencing countries like China or Japan. And so by playing games like that, that allows us to fulfill that.
Yeah, and definitely kind of this traveling idea is that whenever you go to those countries, or just not even physically visit, you see those countries in mass media, you only see like these snapshots, right? The slices of history. You see the slices of Senjoku Japan, you see the ancient China dramas, and they kind of expect that even today, kind of, that's just what they expect. They don't see modern Asia as kind of what is true, right? Nana?
Yeah, and I have to agree with that. Like, through a Western lens, it's usually, like, when you look at other countries, they're usually frozen in time. It's always stagnant. There isn't ever, like, this progression. The West always progresses, whereas, like, other countries don't really. They're always this, like you said, a snapshot. And I don't know if anyone's ever, like, watched Renegade Cut, But there's this great video on Wes Anderson and how Darjeeling Express is like one of these movies that always uses these diverse cultural backgrounds that like are in a certain time frame, but nothing actually, there's nothing that's, it's always like therapeutic for the Western or white character. It's not anything that's like progressive or therapeutic for like the people that actually live there. Like the Indian characters don't actually progress in their stories.
So kind of we've established, we see a lot of these games have Asian themes, Asian cultures today. We'll try not to name too many names, right, we have this perspective of, okay, because we want to see it, but when we do see it, it's that snapshot. What do you guys think kind of motivate all these non-Asian designers? Obviously, the industry is dominated by non-Asian designers, but we're up and rising. We have this panel, lovely people. But what do you think kind of motivates people to make these games that are of cultures that they aren't inherited or stuff? Victoria?
Oh, yes. So there's this media scholar, his name is Irving Goffman, and he talks about this idea, this is an example that will relate to it, it's this idea of the feminine touch. So if you see a lot of advertisements of different options and stuff like that people are trying to sell to you, you'll often see women's hands gently caressing or holding those objects. And the idea of the feminine touch is when you're constructing different media, that this having women's hands touch different products shows that the product is delicate or gentle or precious or something like that. And in a similar way, I feel like Asian themes are so prevalent in analog games because they have a similar effect, but with with this idea of mysteriousness and the unknowable East. And I think people are really drawn to this sort of like fantasy Asian idea. And so that's like my thought on that.
Yeah, it's strong.
And one thing is, I don't think that, the impulse to represent cultures that you find interesting is not an evil impulse, right? So I wouldn't want to put this idea that, if you're not Asian and you are interested in Asia, then you are awful. That's not what we're saying, right? Even, I think this whole idea of this being interested in other cultures isn't even a super conscious thing. No one is like, I am interested in showing the mysterious, i.e. I will show Japan. No one thinks that way. But it's not often an unconscious impulse, right? Because most of these impulses are unconscious. And B, it can be very well-intentioned, right? You're like, I really like this thing about this culture. I want to talk about that. I will talk about that through the art form I practice, which is game design, etc., etc. So it's not to say that because you're interested in depicting things that are different from you, that you are horrible. That's not what I don't think any of us want to say. Well, sorry, I state. That's not what I want to say.
Which is why we need consultants like Mendez.
Yeah.
Subtle plug.
Right, and I think it is important to kind of have that perspective if we're making a game about another culture, to bring on consultants, right? Bring on people who benefit from their culture being exposed, because I think, as many of us would agree, is that when you make a game about another person's culture from a country like America or the West, which has a lot more dominance, these games can affect other people. Like even at the table, people who play these intimate tabletop experiences take away an impression, right? And if all the impressions they're getting are these snapshots or these slices of what you think the the ideal or fantasy is, that's going to affect the people you meet in everyday life, right? I think moving on that, Mendez. So as a cultural consultant, what do you look for? What do you tell people?
For those of you who aren't familiar with the term, cultural consulting or sensitivity reading is a process where the creator of some media brings on someone who has expertise with a certain culture or a certain marginalized population either from personal experience, academic experience, professional experience, something like that. And then the consultant advises the creator on how to present their media in a way that is positive for the people that they're talking about. And you most often hear about this process in the context of sensitivity reading. So like people coming out with novels, the publisher will often bring in someone from, oh, you mentioned that there was like an Indian person in your book. So we're gonna bring in an Indian sensitivity reader to make sure that you're not offending Indians. And it tends to start with like just a perspective of let's not offend these people so they don't get mad at us on the internet, but as a cultural consultant, I try to push people not just to make things which aren't offensive, but which are actually positive for that culture.
Yeah.
And-
Ross?
Yeah, and one of the ways that I focus that, because one person can't speak for an entire culture, is especially on the people who are most vulnerable in that population and how this media will affect the people who are most vulnerable, either because they're in a position of lack of privilege or because they're right there at the table experiencing your product.
So I think what Mendes talked about is very important, so preface. But I also think there is so I work for the Medici Group as my day job, right? Which is a consulting firm that focuses on how diversity drives innovation, right? And I'm not just saying that to plug my company, but plug my company. I think people focus a lot on, oh, we must bring in voices different from us or marginalized voices in order to prevent fires, in order to prevent bad things from happening. And they don't actually focus enough on, do you know, if we have diverse voices in the creative team, the product is going to be better, right? Because if you have people with different perspectives, and if you are from a marginalized community, you will have a different perspective because your life experiences are going to be a little different. Having different perspectives, I and my company, in fact, firmly believes that that is going to make the product better because these different perspectives are going to bring in richer things, especially in the creative realm, right? Game design is an artistic creative field. If you have multiple perspectives, you're going to have more interesting content, more engaging themes, all that kind of stuff. It can be something simple like, oh, I'm from XYZ country, we have a manufacturing process that you don't use that's actually going to make our product better. Even simple things like, I don't know how simple manufacturing is, but you get what I mean. Even some simple things like that are important. So I don't like focusing so much on bringing diversity consultants or bringing a diverse team in order to make sure that our depiction of Nahua speaking indigenous Mexicans is not going to offend people, but bring them in because their perspective is valuable in making the artwork or making a product richer and more interesting.
Yeah, it's all about, it's twofold. It's all about intention. So well-intentions are very important. It's also important to recognize the impact, right? Like Minda said, the most vulnerable of those communities could be, like, you make a game here about, you know, a less powerful, smaller country, that could eventually trickle down because a lot of the influence and pressure is social awareness. Like how aware we in the West are of less privileged countries can literally affect those people. So it's very important. Like, I mean, that's very grand scale. So we're here just to also talk about games because the way you and I, everyday individuals, play these games, that's sometimes how we absorb our opinions and impressions of other cultures, right? So on the topic of intentions, and we're talking about this, what do you guys think are some, for example, bad motivations for why you want to use another culture? Leo?
Sure. So we were talking about this earlier. It's weird, I feel like I can't hear myself. Can y'all hear?
You gotta scoot
I
up.
gotta scoot. Okay, here we go.
Alicia Rice is really good.
Alright,
I keep
I'm
saying your
going
name wrong.
upgrading.
I know I say your
Here
name
we go. Oh my god.
Oh, there it is.
This
Yeah,
one's all
that's
So-
the big one.
I think there is a little bit of burnout regarding what we consider typical Western fantasy, like Tolkien-inspired fantasy, and people want to see new themes. And to be fair, Asia has a lot of great stories to tell, and there are a lot of great themes to explore, and people recognize that, but often they're seeing it kind of rehashed by a Western author. So in the YA lit community, there's the own voices movement, right? And I think game designers can take a lot away from that, and the point of that is that you have authors who are telling their own stories or telling stories about characters that also are from their own backgrounds. And I don't know if we actually use that exact same hashtag in the game design community, but we probably should. Because we do get a distorted view of what Asian stories are like if we are only seeing it over and over again rehashed by authors who aren't, or game designers who aren't Asian.
Yeah, it's definitely that appeal of the other fantasy, right? You can make a game about another game with elves and orcs and magic and wizards, but at the end of the day, if your motivations come down to, oh, but I want to stand out, right? I want to stand out in this market, and I honestly really love ninjas, and this is going to stand out from a knight with magic. I think you need to really analyze that, where that place of motivation is coming from, right? So yeah, like Leo said, it's definitely the alternative Toki. And there's a lot of stuff there, but so I guess yeah. No.
Okay. So I think Cleo makes a very interesting point, right? And because a lot of people will come to us and be like, oh, Own Voice is great, but I really want to show respect to this culture. You hear this a lot about Native American depictions, right? Or Indigenous American depictions. People often say Indian, but I find that unusual to say. Because anyway,
there's some baggage.
But people are like, oh, well, Own Voice is great, but like I want to like show respect to this thing. But there is a power imbalance there, right? For a long time, systems of colonialism prevented people who are not of certain racial and ethnic categories from telling their stories and from depicting their culture and even from speaking their own language, right? And so it feels a little insensitive if now, after centuries of not being able to tell stories, other people that were formerly colonizing voice, like, well, we want to tell your stories, and since they are the dominant culture and systems of power exist in those ethnic groups, they are the stories that are seen more, right? So that's why the Own Voice thing is important, because if the dominant group sees a story from a minority group and talks about it, those are the stories that will be seen, and not the ones made by the minority groups. And so that is why Own Voice is important. It's not to say that dominant groups are not allowed to tell those stories, but there should be space given, and there should be energy put into minority folks making art about their own experience, or about anything.
Yeah, Chloe.
Cleo.
Cleo?
We
don't mess up everyone's names.
That's Cleo with an I also. But yeah, so I generally have a role, and everybody has like their own kind of set of roles, because sometimes we get tapped, even if we aren't officially a cultural consultant, we'll get tapped to kind of give an Asian stamp of approval broadly for like all Asian themes.
Because we're so distinguished.
And obviously, I mean, there's several problems with that. One, that like one person can't give a stamp of approval for an entire like range of ethnicities. And the other being that often this is like a free labor that we are doing for people. But I also joke about how we must all people of color must have the secret handbook with all the answers, and we're just not giving those answers to people. But really, it's so simple. We could just reference page 96, and the problem is solved there.
Cleo, we don't tell people about the handbook. We don't talk about that.
I'm going to be expelled now from.
First rule of handbook: we don't talk about handbook.
But my role generally is, if you are trying to tell a story about someone from a very like specific, I mean, if you're trying to tell a story about someone from a culture other than one that you grew up with or the one that you're from, probably it's best to give that, if you're trying to specifically explore the themes of that culture, and that's like the main theme or one of the main themes of the work, that is probably a story that's better told by someone who has like lived experience connected to it. That doesn't mean do not include characters that are not like you or themes that are completely outside of your experience, because then we'll have, Western people only writing about Western stuff with no diversity. It's the same thing with...
I am a man. I must never write about a woman because I've never been a woman. No woman in any of my games.
That's so feminist. It's so sensitive.
But generally the rule is, if the story or the game or the experience is about this culture, the key designer or several of the key designers need to be from that culture or background.
Yeah, it's it's like the way of saying, you know, if you just had a person of the background actually be the artist behind Aladdin or Pocahontas, I promise you, the characters will look a little bit different, right? Like it's all about, at the end of the day, like you can never know 100%, right? And so I'm gonna ask some, you know, kind of maybe some general questions I hear a lot, and then we're gonna save the last 20 minutes for questions by you guys, by the way. So stick around for that. But so what would you say to somebody who, for example, says, well, I've done a lot of research. You know, I'm the designer and my publisher together. We're not Asian, but we've done a lot of research online. We've read some history books. Shouldn't that intention be good enough? Like, Mendez, as a professional.
Okay, so there's a couple of levels to this. My first, I tend to assume good faith, even when people don't deserve it. But I think that, so if someone came to me and they told me that, and they were talking about like a historical setting, then I'd say that's great. I think it's totally awesome that you did a bunch of research about this culture, and that's really cool. But I hope that your research also included research into the lived experiences of people from that culture today, because the main danger, if you're making a game about, like, I don't know, feudal historical Japan, which I'm doing, even though I'm not Japanese. So the main danger that I'm worrying about there, for me, is not that I'm going to get historical Japan wrong, because I have a degree in Eastern Classics, and I've done a lot of research on the internet and elsewhere. The main danger, the thing that I'm most likely to miss, is if I make something there that's going to be harmful to Japanese Americans or Japanese people playing the game today. And that has to do with not history books, but with real-world lived experience. So that's something that's much, much harder to glean from historical research.
Mm-hmm. And it's like we said earlier with the, you know, very basic level of you and I were at a table, that whatever you see there, that might travel with you for the rest of your life. And so if you meet somebody that depiction was wrong or just that snapshot, you meet somebody modern in Japan, they're not going to be the stereotype you might have already in your head because of that one game or that one movie you watched, right?
And just because we don't want to assume knowledge or I statements, I don't want to assume anything. I want to set the baseline that depictions of people in media are very important and do affect the lived experiences of everyone, right? If you've read any basic sociology, right, Durkheim talks about social forces are invisible and we cannot perceive sociological forces acting on us and affecting us. So we learn a lot about the world from the media we consume, and we learn it both consciously, like, oh, this is what India looks like, and unconsciously, like, oh, this is what Indian people are like, right? Those things are a product both of our experience and our experience of depictions, right? So, like, people think that, oh, that's not a thing anymore. I'm like, no, I've gone to people and they're like, oh, you don't seem gay, you're not wearing lipstick. I'm like, well, my nail polish, but no. Like, not all gay people are like that, right? So, depictions are very important. And so when Mendez talks about it can be harmful, that is actually a very real thing, not just like, oh, it's harmful. No, like, depictions of any minorities affect those minorities and affect majorities.
Yeah, they can be positive, for sure. Like, we're always, it's very important to have those positive depictions, right? That's why we're up here talking about it. Moving on to another more generic question is that, why aren't you angry about XYZ company in China making a game called The Big Apple about New Yorkers that have the most horrendous stereotypes depicted there, right? Why aren't we angry about that? You know, I see that game and I'm just like, whatever. So why are you so angry when I make a game about a ninja Shaolin monk who worships Indian gods, right? Like, why are you angry?
Everyone should worship Indian gods. I want to be an Indian god.
Yeah, so that table is flipped, right? Like, it's not like the West are the only ones depicting other people. So what would you say about that, Banana?
So I think the biggest difference there is that right now, in terms of like soft power, America is like everything that we consume, or a lot of the media that we consume is American, so that when we see something coming from China, that doesn't have a long-lasting impression. It does, but it's not as long-lasting as something that we see day to day, which is American media. Like, we see that every day, like we were talking about earlier. If you play one game from China, that's just like one thing. And you talked about this, Victoria, where it's like, it's just one thing out of like hundreds of media that we consume that is American. I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Oh yeah, like a recent media example is, so when I don't know if anybody has heard of the movie Crazy Rich Asians, but I hope so.
Yes.
But there was so much pressure on that movie because this was the first time in a very long time that there was a movie coming out with an all-Asian cast. And so whether or not this movie succeeded or failed would determine whether or not Asian Americans would be, or Asians would be featured in American films in the future. And that's very different. So if a movie has an all-white cast, like for example, Jennifer Lawrence can fail in a bunch of movies, but they'll still cast her. Or like Scarlett Johansson, they'll continue casting her in different things even though it fails. And so it's very, when there is a game and it represents Asian themes or Asian people, that might be the one glimpse into the culture that people get. And so it gives off this impression that Asians are all clumped together, even though there are a bunch of countries in Asia, and like India is a part of Asia, and also I'm Filipino, so Southeast Asia is completely forgotten, and it's not as popular as China or Japan, and so we're all just lumped together rather than having our own identities and being seen as multifaceted and being seen as though we could be different.
Yeah, it's all a matter of presence, right? Like, you play one bad game with a really dumb depiction of New Yorkers, you just move on. There's 1,000 other ones waiting for you, right?
There's this really great essay by Edward Said called Orientalism, which is a bad word, but in this context, he talks about like how, and this is coming off of this conversation a little bit, it's like on a tangent. He talks a little about how Asian, and specifically in his essay, he talks about like the Middle East experience and how like the Western lens, when it shines a light on like Middle Eastern themes, everything is all clumped together. Like Egypt is the same as like Iran. Like everything is all the same through this lens, and I think that's like good reading.
It is. That does happen a lot. Like we said, it's the other Tolkien, right? You pick up a book about Asian fantasy. The front cover was like, oh, exciting! This is a book about China. And you flip to the back cover. I was like, oh, I guess it's Japan now, right?
And I've heard the argument a lot that, oh, we should live in a world that is free of borders and culture should be shared equally. And I'm like, that sounds lovely. That is not true, though. We don't live in that world. The differences do exist, and it is very easy for someone from a dominant power to say, yes, this is how things should be, because you're not affected as much as minority people by those differences and separations, right? So I was at a game design workshop run by Avery Alder, designer of Monster Hearts. It was wonderful, and we were talking about like how do you respectfully use themes from other, like what is appropriation, what not appropriation. And one of the artists, very well-meaning, right? So they were lovely artists. They were like, oh, for me, art and culture is like free to use. I should be able to do what I want because it's all about humanity and humanity's output. And I'm like, I would love that to be the case one day, but that is not the case. It is very easy for you as a white person to say, yes, I can use anything, but it is not as easy for me as an Indian person to say that, because the things I wanted to represent were suppressed for a very long time. My grandfather was on the run from the British during the British colonial time, and had to hide in basements for like being Indian and things like that. Like the country I grew up in suppressed Hinduism as a worship practice because they didn't believe that that was legitimate, that it was spawn of the devil or whatever, right? So it's easy if you're a dominant person from a dominant group in any kind of racial or whatever. It's easy to be like, yes, but this is the way it should be. But it's important to think about, but what is it like now?
It is, it's one of those things, yeah, like whenever these kind of fires erupt, people always point over towards the motherland, right? Oh, this person did something Chinese, and Chinese Americans are super angry, but you know, Chinese people in China are like, oh, so cool. It's definitely about where you are and how it affects you, right? It affects me here. I grew up here, and I couldn't wear my clothing here. I'd be made fun of. So, but like Chinese people see that, and it's different, right? If you're in China, obviously it's not an issue. Like you don't expect it. So kind of talking about, you might have noticed something that might be contradictory up here. We've talked many times about, which is, you know, we're just a panel of a couple of Asians who work in this industry, but you should, you know, include people of that diversity. You should consult professional consultants, but at the same time, one person's opinion cannot possibly cover an entire range of voices. And so what would you say to people who have Asian friends, who have talked to maybe their Chinese manufacturer and be like, wow, but they thought this game is really cool. So why are you angry? Like, what would you say to those people? Cleo or Nana? Cleo?
Sure.
Chloe?
Intense
Chloe?
icon. Cleo.
I thought I had it wrong, but I had it right. Great.
So this might seem like a really basic answer, but I'm a really big fan of reading. There's a lot of, and I'm also, again, I'm harkening back to own voices, but when you're doing research, it's really easy to find a lot of textbooks, a lot of materials, academic material, otherwise that's written from Western perspectives. And I think it's not only important to like pick up the one book by someone who's of the background that you're looking to explore, but to pick up multiple books, probably some that are going to contradict each other a little bit. And then, given whatever you're reading might be a little bit dated, to also go out there and like scour the internet and also ask people around you. I mean, there's a very vibrant game design community that obviously we're like seeing part of right here. And some people are willing to point out resources. I think it's important not to do the thing where you like tap one friend, like go
I
into
have one
their,
black friend, I'm not racist.
yeah, like go into their like private message and
Hopefully
being
we'll
like,
have
can you
that.
read my entire game for free and then tell me that everything's okay. I think that it's not like a one-step process. There are multiple things involved.
If I can just jump in for like one line. If you run something by your token whatever race friend and they tell you it's fine and that's it, they're probably trying to get rid of you because you didn't pay them for that.
This is a little bit of a joke, but there's this YouTuber called Logan Paul.
You might have heard of it.
You might have heard of him. And he's not okay, but he was dating Chloe Bennett, so does that make him okay? No. Not really. So that's like something I like to joke about sometimes.
We're all unique individuals and we want to be treated as such, but at the same time, do include us.
I bet Chloe told him about the handbook.
Yes, no.
So I would like to say that this might be a little controversial, but anytime you create artwork, there are going to be people who do not like it. It is impossible to voice an opinion and not have some people who do not agree with that opinion. And it is any opinion. Like, even if you say children should not be murdered in cold blood, psychopaths don't have that opinion, right? Necessarily. I will not speak for psychopaths. I just did. But that is something that you have to remember, and I'm not saying that to say, it's a difficult thing, right? Because on the one hand, you have to remember that there will always be people who don't like your work and who will think something about your work, and everyone is entitled to that, right? But it's also another thing to be like, oh, you're just haters, I made my work, it's super amazing. So you have to, making art is hard. You can't just be like, oh yeah, I'm an artist, blah, blah, blah. You have to think about things, you have to have intention, you have to speak to the different people, speak to Mendez, hire him, pay him. You have to think about things, you have to do your research, you have to do diverse research, not just research that was done in the 20s, because I have done research like that. I'm like, this text is really, really bizarre. And, oh, it was written by an anthropologist in the 20s from England, right? So straddle the line between I can't speak to everyone and everyone have a different opinion, many well-educated people who are into this are going to have different meanings. For example, one of my friends who is Indian hated that Jeho movie. What is it? Slumdog Millionaire, right? He says it's awful, it depicts Delhi in like the worst way possible, but a lot of other Indian friends I know are like, oh, it was great, like it brought to light the realities of New Delhi, right? So it is difficult, and you have to accept that it's difficult, and you have to put in the work, because making art is hard.
Yeah, it's, to piggyback off that, it's possible also to listen to both of those people. You can take in both of their opinions. And it's possible for something to be simultaneously helpful and harmful to a certain demographic. So don't ever just discount someone because more people from that demographic seem to disagree with them. There's something that you can learn and should learn from that other dissenting perspective, whichever side it's on. You can listen to both those people, and you really should.
So yeah, so we're gonna open up questions in a bit. So just some closing baselines, I guess, for all of you local designers and publishers out there. And just in summary, your Chinese manufacturer is probably not gonna tell you something essential because they just want your money. And they want you to get the game made so you can make the most racist thing, and they'll be like, yeah, this is fine, let's print it now, right? So don't ask them. Your one friend from work probably doesn't care unless you're gonna pay him. Find a professional. There is people who are experienced with this. They'll think about it from as many facets as they can, like Min does. His contact information will be made available if you come up to him after the show. He has business cards.
Unsubtle plug.
Unsubtle plug. Yeah, no, and just reach out to these people who have their skin in the game, who have something to lose, but also understand how to really think about people who are going to be most affected. And yeah, realize that your one friend from work probably can't represent all of us at the same time.
And remember I talked about have diverse voices from the beginning, not just to put fires out, because sometimes, especially if you're from a dominant group, you don't know that what you're depicting could have effects because you just don't have that lived experience, which is why it's good to have diverse teams to begin with, whatever your project is, right? If your project is about German beer brewing in the 20th century, it will not harm you to have a Ecuadorian designer on your team just because you're not depicting Ecuadorian beer brewing in the 20th century, right? It is always good to have diverse teams.
Really hammer that point out, but really it feels like something so simple, but so easy to screw up. So just think about your motivations, right? If ever across the line when you pitch this game to a friend or somebody and say, this theme is gonna really stick out because nobody's ever done it before, somebody has, and sticking out and using another culture to do so, that's kind of, the cheap way to do it, right? So I hope that gives you some action items, but we'll now take some questions. If you guys have questions for any of these lovely industry professionals, just raise your hands. First one in the back with the hat with the ears. Oh, we have a microphone. Oh man, this is such a nice setup. Thank you so much.
Hi. I had a two-part question. One part is, it seems that there's a lot of really important discussion around people who want to who maybe unknowingly seek out a tokenized voice to legitimize the work that they're doing. I'm wondering, within the Asian community, are there times where you have to call out your peers because maybe the work that they're doing isn't something that feels as inclusive as it could be? And then to that point, more specifically, does classism ever come into this kind of social justice work?
Yeah. I'll just start, and then whoever wants to jump in. One, I agree, classism is definitely an issue. It's all about vulnerability and impact because we're, like most board gamers we're in a very kind of more wealthy environment, right? We can afford to play board games, right? And I think it might be a little bit beyond the scope of our current panel, but it's definitely a thing that you should focus on. As for the first one, I think we talked about earlier, and that is people, Asian Americans here and Asian Chinese people in China, they're gonna have different opinions about very problematic topics. It's about where their perspectives are, and while I get really angry when people tell me, yeah, but look at all these real Chinese people, I'm like, no, I'm a real Chinese person too. Like, I live here. It just doesn't affect them like it affects me. But yeah, I am faking myself out. Every time I say your name,
It's alright. And it's Cleo Yunsu Davis, if you want my full name.
I couldn't pronounce it, by the way. That's why I'm not saying it.
Yeah, so I think there is also a tendency to be drawn to this idea of like glamour. I love Crazy Rich Asians, but there also is definitely an appeal of like the glamorous Asian culture, given there's like a million different Asian cultures, and a pull towards that again because there is a little bit of mysteriousness with that, and a little bit of like, oh, look at this like luxurious world that we don't know. So I love it when I see depictions in games or like options to play characters that are like Asian working class or like just anything other than I'm like a gajillionaire. And I'm gonna do a self-plug real quick, but I wrote an adventure prompt for kids on bikes because they're coming out with a new book that's specifically about Koreatown in Virginia and kind of like this side of like Korean communities that people don't really know. People usually think of the K-pop side when they think about Korean culture. And I think it's there's a lot of good stories to be told from not quite that sphere.
So, okay, I think the idea of tokenism is complex and multi-layered, right? Because personally, I will be very happy if someone says, Sharon, you're brown, I want to talk to you about this thing, right? Because I have wonderful mocha ice cream colored complexion, and I'm happy with that. But also, I celebrate the fact that I have an Indian background, even though I've spent not much of my life in India. So there's this difference between, separatism and assimilation, right? On the one hand, you want to value differences because differences provoke diversity drives innovation, like my friend does, right? But on the other hand, you also want to be like, yes, but I'm also human, and I have similar experience. We all have shared experiences and different experiences, right? And so I actually get a little annoyed at my friends who are like, oh, they just asked me because I'm Asian. I'm like, yes, they did. And that's okay, because they want to know that. They're valuing this aspect of identity. Someone asked me this question because I'm involved in the, S&M gay community, right? Great, awesome, I will tell you about what I know, and here is my harness, right?
Definitely.
But I'm wearing it tomorrow, so come find me. Under my Indian clothing, so come find me. So that's interesting, right? Because sometimes you value it, sometimes you don't. So for example, I exhibited a game called Diode Logic in 4.4 at an exhibition in Brooklyn recently, and it was about futuristic hackers, and you played the game by dancing, right? Because that's how you hack, you dance. And when I was writing the content for the game, my actors were not South Asian, right? And I set the whole game in this South Asian context, right? All the corporations, all the other hackers, all of them, their names were like Indrajit and things like that. And it was great because white people can't say those names, and I just smile. And one of the actors asked me, so tell me why this setting is all Indian, right? And very well, they were just like, I want to know, I'm acting in your piece, tell me your decisions, right? And I said, why not? Right? Like, why isn't this thing set in India? If I was showing this to an Indian audience, they would not ask me that question. They'd be like, great, it's set in India, awesome, right? Let's hack Tata Consulting, mega corporation, right? Tata Steel, sorry, whatever, don't sue me. But, so sometimes you want the difference to be normalized, and sometimes you want to stand out, and it depends on your artistic intention. And so this idea of tokenism, like, I value when people like, you're a brown gay man who is polyamorous and Ivy League educated, blah, 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 whatever, all those different things that make me who I am. And I'm like, great, because my difference is important. And sometimes I'm like, I'm also just like you, I'm a human.
Yeah, there's definitely that twofold, like, you want to have good representation, but sometimes there doesn't have to be a motivation or meaning for just to have a character who's brown or gay, right? Like, you don't have to be like, oh, it's this and this, such and such. Like, it's fine to just have other people, that's normal, right? So it's very important, like I said, we want to be included, we want to be part of this community. We're not as exotic as people think we are.
I'm very exotic.
He's exotic. It's also his birthday weekend, so. Yeah.
If I could I just throw one thing in? So to speak, to actually answer the original question, guys, yes, we do sometimes call each other out. It happens.
We're gonna have different opinions, definitely.
Yeah, about all kinds of things.
There's always,
We are not a hive mind.
There's always gonna be people who are more hardline and people who are less hardline. That's why it's very important to not stop at just asking your one Asian coworker. You gotta go deeper than that. Sorry, any other questions? All right, your hand went up first right there on this round. I'm sorry I'm not keeping track of previous hands, so just shoot it up immediately.
Hi there. Stuff to tell when it's on. So
Yes.
whenever we're talking about fantasy cultures from like that take place in settings that are themed on culture other than the one that's being written in, language comes to the forefront because I think there's a really some fantasy designers will do something like we'll just put everything in English, right? It's not going to be it's not going to be a katana. It's going to be a curved sword because we're not Japanese, so we're not going to use Japanese words, even though it's clearly Japanese inspired. Other times, a lot of designers like to sprinkle in like authentic words as much as they can and try to like explain their meaning and context. And I'm just curious what your feelings are about that. Like, how do you feel about a game that is, written completely in English by English-speaking people, and then they sprinkle in some, foreign words to sort of like authenticize the theme, versus people who avoid that, I guess.
Okay.
So this comes up in Thousand Arrows, my samurai game. The word samurai doesn't appear very often in Thousand Arrows. We call them knights. Because I think it's a little bit othering, like, that from an English-speaking perspective, we call an English-mounted noble armored cavalier a knight. We call a Spanish jinete, we also call them a knight. We call a French chevalier, we call them a knight. But we call an Indian knight a kshatriya, and we call a Japanese knight a samurai. And that's a little bit othering. And yeah, I get it that a kshatriya is probably more different from an English knight than a French chevalier is, but I still think that translating as much as you could possibly translate into the language that you're already using is a good habit, because it prevents you from othering other cultures. And it's okay to have, so for example, in Thousand Arrows, in our weapon list, it says longsword, and then underneath that we have the Japanese term for it. We have the character, and it says katana. But everywhere in the book where we talk about a Japanese longsword, we just call it a longsword. And I think that that's, generally speaking, a really good habit. And there are other games which don't do that, and then they tend to have like kind of an othering effect.
Mm-hmm. Just like earlier when I was talking about, if you're doing it just to make it more exotic to stand out, it's probably a bad motivation. Let's get some more questions in though. All right. Oh, he went up first. That was very quickly. I'm gonna do a 3, 2, 1 this time.
Thanks. I had a question about artwork. If you're working on a game that's art heavy, or even if you've got art featured in the source book, what stage is the right stage to consider a cultural consulting perspective for that? Or would it be best practice, you mentioned if Pocahontas and Aladdin had Indigenous American or Arabic artists, the art style would probably look different. How would you approach that? What's a good way to tackle that?
So I'm a big proponent of the idea that the art and the words and the layout and the system are not separate things that you like, oh, I'll do this first. Like, sometimes you have to for practical reasons, right? But it is good practice to have basic thoughts about all those things from the onset of a project, right? Marshall McLuhan says the medium is the message. So the way I show the game is also important. Am I going to write an RPG source book, like, like Dungeons and Dragons, or is the entire RPG going to be in the form of cards, like 183 Days, right? The whole RPG comes in cards, right? So it is, I think, it's important to think about that early on. And like I said, involve diverse voices, whatever that means in the context you are working in, early on in the piece, because you may discover at the beginning, because you brought in an artist whose speciality is Japanese woodblock carving. Wait a minute, we didn't think that maybe all the artwork in this book should be in the form of Japanese woodblock carving because it's a game about Japan, for example, right?
Never too early, definitely is the answer, never too early. All right, 3, 2, 1. I think that was first. Right there, in the front. Sorry, I'm making you watch a lot. We have about 4 minutes left. We're going to take this question, answer quickly. Right there in the very front, the lady. Oh, sorry. I actually didn't miss you. I'm sorry. I guess we'll get those two as our last questions. I apologize.
I will hang around afterwards and answer more questions and also give you all my business cards.
Hire him.
So I wanted to ask the panel's opinion on,
Yes.
what about people who are half Asian or born like a third generation born Asian? Do they have another voice to contribute, or is it more like
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I'm a real Chinese person, even if I don't. Like, it's different, right?
It's a very different experience because what I find is as a mixed race Asian person, or mixed ethnicity Asian person, is that our identity and ethnicity seems to be very much more determined by other people's opinion of what it is and whatever is convenient to other people. And that's really hard to navigate on both sides, both on the, if you have one side of the family that's Asian or if you have one side of the family that's white in my case. Both sides will have very strong opinions about that. That's going to affect your decisions as a game designer, and you're going to question yourself a lot more about whether you have the right to tell these stories. And that gives you a very unique voice also that I think needs to be heard, and it makes your research process a lot more interesting because it's kind of hard to find a lot of other voices that are specifically half Asian. And I'm also super happy to talk about this afterwards because I have thoughts.
All right, next question. All right.
I'm not sure if this might count as like a consulting thing, but I am working on a game that does involve aspect of Japanese culture, modern Japanese culture, and I did from the design standpoint want to have how the rest of the modern world does look at it. It's kind of based on Power Rangers, and how the different world kind of the rest of the world interprets that. Does the Japanese influence have more weight? Does that require more care than say if I wanted to give the the African perspective on that?
No, they require about equal.
Yeah, get his business card. All right, we probably have enough time for one more question, maybe.
Yeah, she is very eager, and then we are going to wrap this up. While she walks, we're going to plug ourselves. Anybody want to plug themselves? We have a Kickstarter right over there. Ends tonight at 7 p.m. One last stretch goal to go. 1,000 arrows.
Yeah. Also, K-pop boy member board game coming up next year. That's going to be exciting. All right.
Not a sheet, but can I hear from each
Sorry,
panelist
yeah.
one game that they are really excited about that does Asian representation well, and 1 or 2 bullet points why it's awesome, please.
Personally, BattleCon is a great game for me. It has a wide array of cast of characters in the anime style. No fan service, it's just diverse characters being in a diverse world, being themselves, right? That's kind of what I want, personally. Let's move down the line. Favorite games, basically.
A game that I really like right now is Yokohama, and the reason for that is because it's actually focusing on how Yokohama was previously a fishing village and how it industrialized and focuses on that specific aspect. And why that's so cool is because most games centered on Asian themes focus on the past of Asian countries as opposed to how Asian countries are also moving forward. So that's one that I really like.
Not a favorite game, but can I pitch 7C?
Yeah, okay, cool.
So 7C Katai has a lot of Asian American / Asian voices who are designing
unfortunately we're out of time and they would like us to leave. So, but one last thing, everybody please plug your Twitter, and then we'll get up and go.
I'm Lula Vampiro on Twitter. I'll give you all my
CYS Davis.
I'm Sharung Biswas. There are not many people with that name.
I'm Gay Mina Curry.
I'm Victoria Kanya, but my last name is spelled C-A-N-A. I know it's confusing. I also have a game called Gladius that has an actual diverse representation of Rome as it was. And I'll be in the Unplugged room today through tomorrow if you want to check out my game.
All right, and you can find me, just Google Brother Mean Games. Yeah, I'll be in the pub room today at 3 as well. So, thank you everybody for coming out. I really appreciate this.
We'll be outside. Answer all the questions that we didn't get time for.
I'm really glad. I hope you guys all enjoy something and take something away from this. All right. See you next year, Philadelphia.